Horror story. No one ever visited the old cabin at the edge of the forest. Most locals claimed it was too far off the beaten path, but if you asked them to look you in the eye and tell you the real reason, they'd all skirt around the truth. Cabin's just old, they'd mutter. Seen better days. But deep down, they all remembered the sounds. The faint, eerie creaking that seemed to echo even on still nights, an unsettling sound that seemed to bleed out from the forest like a whisper of something long forgotten. There was only one man who passed by that cabin regularly, Samuel. A forester by trade and solitude by nature. He roamed the thick woods each morning, his rifle slung over his shoulder and his eyes trained for the slightest movement in the underbrush. As the seasons turned, Samuel had grown used to the sounds of the forest. The snap of twigs, the rustle of undergrowth, the distant hoot of an owl, all became the familiar background hum of his world. But there was something about the cabin. Even Samuel couldn't shake the feeling that something watched him each time he passed. One crisp autumn morning, Samuel set off as usual. The air was sharp and quiet, with a faint mist clinging to the ground as he moved through the trees. His boots made heavy prints in the damp earth, crunching leaves underfoot. And then, just as he reached the narrow path leading past the cabin, he heard it again. The creaking. It started soft, like a door swinging slowly, tentatively open and then shut. Then again open and shut. The sound never stopped. It was the way you might expect a neglected house to groan against the wind, but the air was still, not even a hint of a breeze to push the ancient wood. The chill Samuel felt wasn't from the autumn air. He forced himself to keep walking, shoulders tense, eyes glued to the trail ahead. He told himself it was just the shifting of wood, maybe some animal finding a nook to settle in. He didn't believe it. His grip tightened around his rifle, and for the first time he thought about taking a different route, one that would lead him clear of that cursed place. But a forester never lets himself get spooked, he reminded himself. Not by an old house. Yet as he moved further from the cabin, the creaking grew louder in his memory. The uneven rhythm of it had clung to him, as if it were somehow listening, adjusting. With every step he took, Samuel's mind couldn't shake the thought that even now, it was still creaking. Opening and shutting. Opening and shutting. He stopped, heart pounding in his chest. It was irrational, he knew. But his eyes drifted back over his shoulder, down the path to where the cabin was hidden behind a dense thicket of trees. Nothing but silence now. He shook himself and moved on, all the while with an uneasy feeling that somewhere behind him, an unseen door had opened and closed once more. The hunter arrived at dusk, a lone figure cutting through the mist-laden forest trails, his horse a dark shadow pacing quietly beside him. He was a stranger to these parts, an outsider who came only at the turn of the season, when the deer were plenty and the wolves more cautious. Tonight, he had ventured farther than usual, crossing the river and navigating the dense, twisting woods to a cottage he'd been told of by fellow travelers. The cottage stood like a dark sentinel at the edge of a clearing, faint candlelight flickering from its small windows. The air around it was damp and still, heavy with the weight of old trees pressing in close. He knocked twice, and after a moment, the door creaked open to reveal an elderly man with wary eyes, his wife peering from the shadows behind him. "Good evening," the hunter greeted, tipping his hat respectfully. "I was told you might have a spare bed for a traveler. I'm headed to the northern woods in the morning." The old man nodded, his mouth tightening into a thin line. "You're welcome to share our meal, stranger. Not often we get visitors willing to linger by these woods." As the hunter entered, he noticed the walls adorned with dried herbs, the scent of rosemary and sage masking a subtler, mustier smell, one he couldn't quite place. They led him to a modest table set with a simple meal, bread, stew, and a bottle of something dark that caught the light in a strange, almost purple hue. The meal began in uneasy silence, the hunter sensing a tension in his hosts as they exchanged wary glances. Finally the old man spoke. "I reckon you're not from these parts," he said, stirring his spoon thoughtfully. "Our forests are deep and our folk, quiet. But you're headed north?" The hunter nodded. "I've heard good game roams those woods." "Aye, there's game," the man agreed, his voice dropping a shade lower. "But there's a hut out there by the ridge. Abandoned, they say. Only it's not empty." The hunter looked up, his interest piqued, but the old man's wife visibly shivered, her hands stilling mid-motion. "What do you mean?" he asked, feeling the prickle of intrigue running along his spine. The old man's gaze was steady, but his eyes flickered with a strange unease. "We've had hunters go missing, folks who've wandered too close. Some say it's just the forest swallowing them up, but others—" He trailed off, his voice darkening. "They say the hut calls to those who venture too near. Like a whisper that creeps into your mind and makes you Forget where you are. A hut that calls to you? The hunter let out a low, skeptical chuckle, though he felt a faint chill settle over him. Seems I'd be all right to just keep to myself? The wife, who had remained silent, finally spoke. Her voice was almost a whisper, yet it carried a raw edge of fear. Please, sir, take your horse with you when you go. Animals sense things we can't. If it's the horse that first hears the whispers, you may be warned in time. Or pulled back from wherever it tries to take you, the old man added, gripping his mug so tightly his knuckles went white. Only one man came back to tell the tale, and he swears he never walked the steps to that hut. But when he came to, his feet were inches from its doorway. The hunter nodded slowly, their words lingering in his mind even as he tried to shake off the weight of their superstition. After all, he'd faced enough in the wilderness not to be scared off by a ghost story. Yet, the way they spoke, so convinced, left him troubled in a way he couldn't quite dismiss. As he prepared to leave for bed, the old man clapped a hand on his shoulder, his face shadowed in the dim light. Be careful, stranger. The forest is treacherous enough, but there are things in those woods beyond the natural. He hesitated, his eyes flicking to the small window, as though he feared something might be watching from the darkness outside. Listen to your horse. And if you hear a voice calling, don't answer. The hunter retired to the guest bed, their words haunting him long into the night. The flicker of the candle cast strange, shifting shapes across the wooden walls, and though he was used to the noises of the night, here every creak and whisper seemed amplified, fraught with some unseen presence. At dawn he'd pack up his gear, saddle his horse, and venture into the woods as planned. But he could not shake the feeling that somewhere in that forest, something was waiting for him. Dawn came sluggish and gray, with the sun fighting a losing battle against clouds that hung heavy and low. The hunter packed his things quietly, slinging his rifle over his shoulder and lacing his boots as his hosts lingered in the doorway. The old man and his wife watched him with that same dark glint in their eyes, a caution mingled with something else, pity perhaps or foreboding. Take care, stranger, the old man said, his voice gravelly with sleep or worry. And remember what I told you about the forest. Stick to the marked trails. The hunter gave a curt nod. I'll be back by nightfall. The old man's wife Martha reached out suddenly, her fingers light on the hunter's arm, and he felt a shiver course through him at her touch. Her skin was like parchment paper stretched over bone, her grip surprisingly strong. Remember your horse, sir, she whispered urgently. If you lose him, turn back. No matter what you hear calling, don't go any further. And, she hesitated, casting a nervous glance toward the shadowy woods. If you pass that old hut, don't look inside. With a final nod, he mounted his horse and urged it forward, the old couple's warnings echoing in his mind, weaving into the rhythm of the forest sounds around him. He kept his eyes trained on the path, the quiet crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot somehow more intense, more menacing than he'd anticipated. The forest seemed different from the day before. The trees arched overhead like silent watchers, their branches tangled and dark, blotting out most of the morning light. Mist clung to the ground, curling around his boots as he rode, swirling in ghostly patterns that seemed to waver and twist as he passed through. As he ventured deeper, he became aware of an eerie quiet, the kind that hangs heavy like the world itself is holding its breath. Even his horse grew restless beneath him, its head jerking at the faintest rustle, its ears twitching back and forth as if picking up something beyond his hearing. Every now and then, the hunter would reach down to pat its neck, muttering a low reassurance he himself didn't quite believe. The trail wound sharply to the left, cutting around a dense thicket before curving uphill toward the ridge. That's when he saw it. The hut. It was smaller than he'd imagined, no more than a shack, really set back from the trail like it had been forgotten. The wood was dark with age, sagging in places, the roof patched with moss and damp straw. A window sat crookedly in one wall, black and empty, like a gaping eye. The door hung slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness within, a void that seemed to pulse, waiting. The hunter felt a chill crawl up his spine. He'd been given clear warnings, but something about the hut drew him. Something old and almost magnetic, a pull that settled into the marrow of his bones. He nudged his horse forward, thinking to pass it by, when suddenly the animal reared up with a piercing, terrified neigh, its hooves kicking up dirt as it strained away from the path, back toward the denser forest. "Whoa!" he shouted, his hands gripping the reins tightly as he tried to bring it under control. The horse twisted, its eyes rolling wildly, nostrils flaring as though it had scented something foul. It whinnied and reared again, nearly throwing him as it backed away from the hut, its entire body trembling with a fear that went beyond anything he'd ever seen. The hunter clambered off, intending to calm it, but the horse jerked violently out of his grip, its bridle slipping free as it turned and bolted into the trees, its figure vanishing like a shadow among shadows. He cursed under his breath, watching as his horse disappeared into the mist, the sound of its hooves fading swiftly. For a moment he considered going after it, chasing it down, but something held him rooted to the spot. It was the hut. He couldn't help but feel that it was calling to him, its door creaking open a bit further, a thin wisp of smoke curling out from the threshold, smelling faintly of something sweet and decaying. A voice, soft as the whisper of leaves in the wind, drifted to him, familiar yet strange, and it sent a chill prickling up his neck. "Turn back, you have no place here." He recognized it as Martha's voice, yet it felt disembodied, distant, as though it were coming from somewhere deep in the forest. The words echoed, trailing off into an unsettling silence. But he was too far gone now, curiosity and some unspoken compulsion pulling him forward. He pushed the door open, stepping into the shadowed entryway, and immediately felt the temperature drop. The air inside was thick, damp, and filled with an odd scent, a blend of rotting wood, damp earth, and something floral, sickly sweet and wrong. Once he crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind him with a force that shook the walls, and he spun around, his hand instinctively going for the handle. But it wouldn't budge. He was locked in, trapped by some unseen force that sent a chill washing over him. He was suddenly filled with the sensation that he'd made a terrible mistake. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he took in the strange interior. The room was larger than he'd anticipated, almost impossibly so, with walls that seemed to stretch outwards, twisting at strange angles that defied logic. Shadows moved where there should have been none, pooling in the corners and stretching along the floor like tendrils reaching out toward him. In the center of the room, a long, low table was set with peculiar objects: a rusted metal bowl filled with dark, viscous liquid, a cluster of waxen candles, half melted and arranged in the shape of a pentagon, and strangest of all, a doll made of straw, its eyes two polished black stones that seemed to glisten as they caught the faint light. His breath came in shallow gasps, the stifling air clawing at his throat. He heard the faintest rustling from somewhere beyond a half-open doorway on the far side of the room, and with each second, the sense of being watched grew more intense, more suffocating. He tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to him as if the shadows themselves were alive, slithering closer, reaching out for him. And then, faint and eerie, he heard a soft humming, a melody lilting and slow like a lullaby gone sour. It was coming from beyond the open door, from the shadows that seemed to deepen and pool in the adjoining room. Against his will, his feet began to carry him toward the sound, each step heavy, as though the floor itself were trying to hold him back. Martha's voice flared up again in his mind, sharp with warning. "This little old woman wants to lure you inside." But the words faded, muffled by the thick silence that surrounded him, as though something had heard her warning and stifled it, cutting it off. All that remained was the soft, insistent pull of the song, winding its way into his mind, drowning out all reason. He reached the doorway and peered into the next room. It was empty save for a chair set facing the wall, its back turned to him. An icy draft crept along the floor, and he could see faint symbols etched into the wooden planks, strange markings that seemed to shift and writhe as he looked at them. The door behind him creaked shut, the finality of it echoing through the hut, and he felt a wave of dread settle over him. The chair slowly began to turn as though pulled by invisible hands, revealing an old woman seated in it, her face veiled in shadow. Her skin was ashen, wrinkled, and her eyes glinted like polished stones, unblinking, fixed on him with a gaze that seemed to pierce straight through him. A twisted smile spread across her face, and she spoke in a voice as dry and brittle as autumn leaves. "I knew you'd come. They always do." The hunter tried to move, to back away, but his legs felt frozen in place, his pulse thundering in his ears as her gaze held him captive. The air grew colder still, the shadows tightening around him as the room seemed to stretch, pulling him toward her. In that terrible moment, he understood with gut-wrenching clarity that he had walked straight into a trap. The ghost appeared without warning, flickering to life as if born from the shadows themselves. One moment, the hunter was staring at the unsettling grin of the old woman in the chair, and the next, her figure dissolved, melting into an apparition, a figure of mist and wisp floating just inches from him, her cold eyes unblinking. But now the ghost's shape began to shift, taking on the appearance of Martha, his old host, with her deeply lined face and worried expression, her eyes wide and glassy with fear. She floated toward him, her hand reaching out, fingers trembling as though she wished to grab him and pull him back from the edge of some invisible cliff. "Foolish man," the apparition rasped, her voice low and echoing, like it was coming from the depths of a well. "You were warned. You were told to leave this place." He tried to respond, but his throat felt closed off, his voice snatched away by the thick air pressing in on him. He could only watch, helpless, as the ghostly image of Martha began to fade and shift once more. This time, the figure grew taller, younger, until it formed the shape of a boy, a familiar face, one that bore a striking resemblance to the old man who had opened the cottage door to him that night. It was their son, a specter from some past memory, his small face twisted with fear and confusion, staring directly at him with a pleading look. "Mama's been worried, Papa," the child's voice whispered, though the words were jumbled and fractured as if caught between worlds. "I told her to stay away from the woods, but she wouldn't listen." The hunter felt his heart pound with a dread that had little to do with the specter before him. Instead, it was a dread born of the nagging realization that he had made a grave mistake, one he could never undo. He should have taken their warnings to heart. He should have ignored the pull of curiosity and resisted the dark allure of the hut. But it was too late. "Why did I ignore them?" he thought bitterly, anger flaring up in him, turning hot as it mixed with the cold terror pooling in his gut. "Why did I think I was immune to the dangers of this place?" Martha's voice came again, low and mournful. "You were warned. You knew better. Now, it's too late." He tried to move, to flee, but his legs felt rooted to the spot. Shadows coiled around his ankles like tendrils, and the temperature dropped even further, sending a deep, bone-chilling cold through his body. The light grew dimmer, the walls seeming to fold inward, trapping him. His breaths came fast and shallow as the floorboards beneath him let out a long, tortured creak, sagging as though they could no longer bear his weight. The ghostly apparitions vanished, replaced by an all-consuming darkness that pressed in close. Panic surged through him as the wood groaned once more, cracking beneath him with a sickening sound, and before he could even brace himself, the floor gave way entirely. He fell, his arms flailing as he tumbled down into the suffocating blackness. He crashed into something soft but dense, like a pile of damp, rotting cloth or moss-covered earth. The smell was overwhelming, mold, decay, and something else, a metallic tang that made his stomach lurch. He struggled to sit up, his hands clawing at the damp surface beneath him, but his fingers met with a cold, sticky substance that clung to his skin. The darkness was impenetrable, pressing in on him from all sides, swallowing any trace of light. His eyes strained, his heart pounding as he tried to make sense of his surroundings, but all he could feel was the strange, yielding surface beneath him, shifting slightly as though it were alive. "Hello?" he called, his voice weak, swallowed up by the thick air around him. "Is anyone there?" His voice barely echoed, muffled by the oppressive dark. He shouted louder, his voice tinged with desperation, but it was as though the darkness itself absorbed the sound, leaving him in suffocating silence. He tried to climb to his feet, but his footing slipped, his hands grasping at whatever surrounded him, feeling only the cold, damp squish of unidentifiable forms. He gagged as his fingers brushed against something round and smooth, a bone, perhaps, or the remains of some unfortunate soul who had wandered here before him. Panic clawed at his mind, threatening to overtake him as he frantically tried to orient himself. He knew, with a sinking dread, that there would be no way out if he couldn't keep his wits. In the pitch black, he could feel the pile shifting beneath him like it was alive, a subtle shifting and writhing just beneath the surface. He dug his hands in, trying to find solid ground, but the deeper he pressed, the more he felt the sensation of countless small, cold objects. Bones, twisted roots, decaying flesh, the remnants of lives lost to the darkness. "Damn it," he muttered, his voice thick with frustration and fear. He was buried alive, surrounded by the dead and the rotting, entombed in a pit of despair from which he knew he'd never climb out alone. Suddenly, a faint light flickered above him. He looked up, hope sparking in his chest, but the light was dim and sickly, barely illuminating the edges of the pit he'd fallen into. And then, to his horror, he saw shapes. Shadows that seemed to writhe and twitch, figures barely discernible against the walls of his prison. The flickering light grew slightly brighter, and the shadows sharpened, revealing gaunt, elongated faces, their eyes hollow and empty, mouths open in silent screams. They watched him, their bodies twisted in unnatural poses, their expressions frozen in expressions of terror and agony. A chill crept down his spine as he realized these weren't just shadows. These were souls, the lost remnants of others who had been trapped here, who had fallen prey to the same curiosity, the same fatal lure of the hut. Why did you come?" one of the shadowed figures whispered, its voice a faint rasp, barely more than a breath. "Why did you ignore the warnings?" The hunter felt his heart hammering in his chest, but he couldn't answer. There was no excuse he could give, no answer that would satisfy these wraiths, these lost souls who had suffered the same fate. His throat tightened, his mind reeling with the reality of his situation. He was just another victim, another fool who had thought himself immune to the curses of this place. He tried to move again, to scramble up the shifting pile beneath him, but it was useless. Every movement only seemed to sink him deeper, the darkness swallowing him inch by inch. He could feel the cold, sticky tendrils wrapping around his ankles, snaking up his legs, pulling him down with a slow, relentless force. "Help me," he whispered, though he knew no one would hear him. He could picture Martha back in her small cottage, wringing her hands, staring out the window with that same haunted expression, knowing that yet another traveler had fallen to the forest. He clawed desperately at the walls, his fingers scraping against the damp, crumbling wood, but it was no use. The floor beneath him continued to give way, and he felt himself slipping further into the depths, into the unknown void that awaited below. The light above flickered one last time, casting the twisted faces of the shadows in sharp relief, their hollow eyes fixed on him, as though watching his descent with grim satisfaction. And then, with a final shuddering creak, the last remnants of the floor gave way completely, and he fell, plunging deeper into the abyss, his screams swallowed up by the darkness that devoured him whole.